Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Susana Monsó. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Logic, History, and Philosophy of Science at Universidad Nacional de Educación Distancia in Madrid, Spain. Her work focuses on the socio-cognitive abilities of animals and their ethical implications. And today we're going to focus mostly on her book. The title is in Spanish, La zarigüeya de Schrödinger, Cómo viven y entienden la muerte los animales. So hopefully one day there will be an English translation. So Dr. Monsó, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So before we get into really the topic of the book, could you tell us a little bit about comparative thanatology? Because it seems to be, at least as far as I understand, a fairly recent discipline within the field of evolutionary biology. So what is it about?
Yeah, so comparative thanatology is the study of animals' relationship with death, study of the behaviors that they carry out surrounding death, and maybe the emotions and the cognition that are related with it. And as you pointed out, it is a fairly new discipline. So there are reports of animals' reactions to death that go back far in time, but we could more or less situate the official start of comparative thanatology as a discipline in 2010, when James Anderson and colleagues published the first report of the reactions of a group of chimpanzees to the decease of a female in a safari park. And they documented a series of reactions there, and they argued that what they found was interesting enough to warrant the emergence of a discipline on this. And I think since then, well, there has been an explosion of reports on comparative thanatology, and now there are also some groups that are carrying out more systematic empirical studies, but yeah, it's still a very, very young discipline.
Yeah, but in this case, you're a philosopher. So to deal with this issue, we have, of course, evolutionary biology, but what would you say in this particular case would be the role that philosophy can play here?
Right. So I think that philosophers can play a role in whichever science we're talking about, because science is never done in a philosophical vacuum, but rather scientists are always making philosophical choices, from very basic ontological commitments regarding what causality is, for instance, to philosophical commitments about the concepts that they use, the methodologies that they use, how they analyze the data, etc. So there's always room for philosophers to join in the debates. In the case of comparative thanatology, I think it is especially necessary because of the youth of this discipline. So the fact that it's so young means that its terms, are not very clearly defined yet, and the philosopher is specialized in conceptual clarification. So I think we have, an interesting role to play in this debate, and that's what I've been trying to do.
Mm-hmm. So before we get into how some animals might have an understanding of death, I think we have to take several steps before that, starting with animals having minds. So how can we know that non-human animals have minds?
Well, that is, of course, a very difficult question to answer, because, as you know, there is an age-old philosophical problem called the problem of other minds, namely, how can I know that others have minds? And this problem is notoriously unanswerable, even for the case of other human beings. Like I cannot be 100% sure that other human beings have minds. But of course, in our day-to-day lives, we never doubt that. I mean, it would be super strange if we actually doubted that other human beings have minds. So there are arguments that we can give for why animals have minds as well, or at least many animals have minds as well, that have to do with, well, different sort of argumentative strategies. So on the one hand, we can argue using some sort of analogy. For instance, we can say, well, human beings who are able to solve problems do it using thought processes, and we know that these animals can solve problems. Therefore, they probably also have some thought processes. Or we can make some sort of inference to the best explanation. You know, if we see very complex behavior in an animal, we can say, well, the best explanation for this complex behavior is that the animal is not just some sort of automaton, but rather that it has beliefs, desires, a personality, etc., that are interacting with the input it's getting from the world and generating these different behaviors. And we can also make an argument from sort of evolutionary parsimony, where you know, species that are closely related to us, and we know that we have minds, it's probably more parsimonious to postulate that they also have minds, due to, well, how evolution works, etc. But of course, I mean, these arguments aren't necessarily going to convince every skeptic, but then if you're going to be you know, rational and fair, then you would also have to be a skeptic about human minds. In my case, I think what I find the most convincing, and I think this goes back to something Daniel Dennett said once, is those cases where you see an animal behaving in a way that shows that he is interpreting the world in a wrong way. I always give this example of those YouTube videos of the dog who's trying to go into the garden, but he doesn't realize that the glass door is actually open, and he's waiting for his human to open the door, right? There's no actual glass door there, so we can't blame it on the stimulus, but rather on some internal thought process in the dog where he is used to there being a glass door, and etc. So yeah. It's not an easy question to answer, but we do our best.
Yeah, I think that in this case the biggest skeptics would be the solipsists, right? But those people do not even believe in other minds to begin with, even when it comes to humans, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, and what is a concept then? Because we have to get into animals having a concept of death, and at least when it comes to humans, that seems obvious, I think. But what is a concept?
Yeah. So concepts, in a very broad sense, concepts are understood to be what makes up a lot of our thoughts. Not all thoughts necessarily have to be concept-based, but certainly a lot of our thoughts are. Now, when it comes to what a concept is, unfortunately, as with almost everything in philosophy, there are a lot of different theories. So I can't really give you like a definition that's going to satisfy everyone. But what I try to do in my work on the concept of death is I depart from a conception of concepts that sort of, I think, picks up a lot of the key abilities that philosophers have typically associated with concept possession. Yeah, and these abilities have to do with different things, like for instance, being able to display different behaviors in response to the same stimulus, or the same behavior in response to different stimulus. So what's called the distance requirement, this idea that there must be some distance from the world. Other abilities that come with concepts are, for instance, the ability to engage in certain inferences. Once you classify something as being part of a concept, or being an instance of a concept rather, you can derive some implications, because you know that, well, for instance, if something is a dog, you can make certain inferences, like, well, then probably it's going to have 4 legs, and it's going to bark, and it's going to like catching balls, etc., because these are things that dogs usually do. And concepts also, some people have linked concept possession to the ability to learn and improve your categorization processes. So having a concept is not just being able to classify things as belonging in a certain class, but also being able to somehow improve your classification process if you've made a mistake in your classification.
So, I mean, even if people do not generally agree on these on these concepts, like the concept of a concept, let's say, I mean, there's still probably ways of experimentally testing if animals react in a way or behave in a way that might be indicative of them having a concept of something like death in this case.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, that I'm not really very interested in the specific debate on whether the concept of death, as I construe it, is actually a concept. I know that some people don't think that what I call concept is actually a concept, and they might think it's better to call it a conception, or something like that. But for me, that's ultimately a matter of just putting a label on it, stipulating what we're calling this. And what I'm actually interested is in the actual abilities I'm talking about. So what can the animal do with this thing that I'm talking about? So long as that part is clear, it's not really so important to me whether or not it's a concept.
Mm-hmm. In the book, you talk about stereotypical and cognitive reactions to death. What's the difference there?
Yeah, so this is a distinction that is often found in the literature, and I'm not actually sure how empirically precise it actually is, because I think in the actual world, the difference between the two is very fuzzy and might not actually exist that clearly. But there seems to be some difference between the two. So stereotypical reactions would be reactions that are sort of hardwired in the individual, that are quite rigidly dependent on certain stimuli in the environment, that are quite homogeneous across members of the same species, and are not really under cognitive control, so to speak. So the animal, it's more or less an automatic reaction.
Could
So an
you,
example.
yeah, you were going to give an example. I was about to ask it. So.
Yeah. So an example of this is, for instance, what's called necrophoresis, which is a behavior that some eusocial insects like ants engage in upon finding a corpse in their nest. So this is a behavior that consists of picking up the corpse and taking it out of the nest into the refuse pile that they have outside the colony. And this is typically regarded as a stereotypical reaction because of a very famous experiment that Edward O. Wilson performed in the 50s. And in this experiment, they found that this nigrothoracis behavior is triggered, at least one of its triggers is a chemical that dead ants give off, which is called oleic acid. And so they found that this is triggered quite rigidly, because if you take a rock or a little pebble or a piece of leaf or even a live ant, and you put a drop of oleic acid on them, the other ants will pick it up and take it out of the colony. So even if the ant is moving around and sort of signaling in other ways that it's not dead, the ants still engage in this behavior. So that's why we say it's a stereotypical reaction, even though the story is actually more complicated. So recent papers argue that ants actually show more sophisticated behaviors in response to dead conspecifics, like sometimes they might decide to bury them or cannibalize them depending on other environmental factors. So it's not as straightforward as the usual story that's told. But anyway, we can still kind of distinguish that from what we see in, for instance, chimpanzees, if we go to the other end of the spectrum. So an example that I think illustrates this quite nicely is this paper that came out a few years ago. I think it was Van Leeuwen was one of the authors, where they reported the behaviors of a group of chimpanzees to the death of an adolescent male of the group. And here we see a huge range of reactions. We see some chimpanzees reacting with something that looks like curiosity, sniffing the body or touching it. Others seem kind of subdued and just sitting and observing it. Others seem frustrated or angry, and they're displaying at the corpse, or they are hitting the corpse. And then at some point, the group members leave, but one stays behind with her daughter, and this was a chimpanzee that had an especially close relationship with this particular individual, and she grabs a little twig and starts cleaning the teeth off the dead chimpanzee. Now, this is a super interesting example because it shows the range of reactions, and this range of reactions shows us that not necessarily that they have a concept of death, but it does show us that there are cognitive and emotional mechanisms at play here, that the animals are behaving in different ways depending on their beliefs, desires, their personalities, their particular histories and previous experiences, etc. So it's, even though the distinction between stereotypical and cognitive might not be as straightforward as I write it in the book, because the book is for a popular audience, so I try to not get too technical. There is at least something to be said in the difference in complexity and variability that we see in these two species.
Mm-hmm. So I have to ask you, because I guess that this is something that the skeptics would bring to the table very quickly when reacting to, for example, the examples you just gave. To what extent do you think we should be aware of anthropomorphism in this case? I mean, attributing similar mental states that are similar to ours to other animals when they're reacting to a dead body, for example.
Yeah. So anthropomorphism is definitely a danger and something that we should take very seriously. So typically, anthropomorphism, even though the term itself is purely descriptive, it merely means attributing human-like characteristics to something else, be it an animal or a god or whatever. Usually, the way it's used in comparative psychology and other sciences, it has a normative side to it. So the idea is not only that this is the attribution of human-like characteristics, but it's a mistake as well. Mm-hmm. So that's how it's typically understood. And of course, if we understand it that way, we should be very wary of committing that mistake. But we can't assume from the start that all attribution of human-like categories to animals is going to be a mistake, right? That would be begging the question. Because we know at least some things that humans have, animals also have, like certain hormones or, lungs or heart, etc. Right? We do share some characteristics, but usually anthropomorphism relates to the attribution of mental capacities of various sorts. So Kristen Andrews and Brian Huss have this paper that I really like and I always refer to, where they introduce the notion that they call anthropectomy. So anthropectomy would be sort of the mirror error to anthropomorphism. If anthropomorphism is the mistaken attribution of human-like characteristics to animals, anthropectomy is the mistaken denial of human-like characteristics to animals. And they argue that both errors are equally errors, and there's no reason to fear one over the other because they both constitute a false description of how the world is. And I think that this is absolutely right. And I understand that among scientists that the stress is on avoiding anthropomorphism because humans do have problematic tendencies to over-mentalize. There's this very, very famous study from I believe it's the 40s. Hyder and Simmel have this animation of just geometric shapes moving around, and when we watch it, we can't avoid attributing intentions and even personalities to these geometric shapes. So clearly we have a problem there, and it's good that we put an emphasis on trying to avoid it, but we shouldn't overshoot because we also have to be careful not to under-attribute, because that's also unfair, so to speak, to the animals. And we should never forget that what we say or what we find out about animal minds has also important implications at the ethical and political level. So it's very important to try to get things right.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that people have to keep in mind that there's biological continuity, right, between us and other animals. I mean, they can focus perhaps on the great apes, but we can go further down the line in evolutionary history. And I mean, if there's continuity in terms of physiology and behavior, there should be at least some continuity in terms of psychology as well. Right.
Yeah, that's what I think as well. And in some cases, I think the evidence is very compelling. Like, for instance, I think of the case of social mammals and what are traditionally called case strategists. So these animals who have very few offspring, but invest a lot of effort into taking care of them to ensure that they reach maturity. So these are species where typically the offspring are very defenseless, or they can't really make it on their own. I mean, obviously humans are the best example of this, because if you drop a baby in the middle of a forest, well, the baby is done, right? But yeah, a lot of other species also depend on the mother's care or the father's care or the group's care in order to make it to maturity. And it's I think quite likely to be the case that you need there to be some strong psychological motivation for the mother to be there or the parent to be there and take care of the baby, because if not, you risk that baby being abandoned, right? And or eaten or whatever. And of course that's going to be a problem from an evolutionary perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I guess that you're talking about mother-infant relationships because that's probably one of the most basic social relationships that are out there for animals. But just looking across different species, many animals have very complex social lives, so it would be really hard to understand how they wouldn't also have complex psychological lives.
Yeah, exactly. Whenever you see complexity at the behavioral level, you're going to have to appeal to some psychological complexity to explain it.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to death specifically, I guess that, and this is something that you also talk about in the book, that another mistake that we as humans tend to make is that we sometimes intellectualize too much. But when it comes to, for example, another animal having a concept of death, it doesn't have to be a highly intellectual concept, right?
Right. So yeah, this is what I've called intellectual anthropocentrism. So it's the idea that we see sometimes present in some comparative thanatology texts and also amongst philosophers who have discussed animals' relationship with death. It's this idea that the only way of understanding death, or perhaps the only proper way of understanding it, it's the human way. And this has led to characterizations of the concept of death that are extremely cognitively demanding, that have to do with having a very explicit understanding of time, of the finite nature of life, a concept of absence, etc. So a lot is being built into the concept of death. And this turns into a question that is kind of posed in binary terms, where the animals either have this or they don't have any concept of death at all. And that just seems to me to be a very strange way of posing the question, especially if we think about how non-human children acquire concept of death, because it usually takes human children about 10 years to fully master the difference of components of the concept of death. But we typically attribute a concept of death or some concept of death to younger kids. Like I have a brother who just turned 13, but I can very clearly remember when he was around 6 or 7 and we played Super Mario together, and he had some understanding of Super Mario. My character died now. And it was probably not a very sophisticated one, but there was something already there. So yeah, I think very often we've been putting the cart before the horse here, and kind of, or the horse before the cart before the horse, yeah. Because very often we've been kind of already asking the questions in terms of, can animals have the most complex concept of death that we can imagine? Well, obviously no, but that's just not a very interesting question. I think the more interesting question is, can they have anything that counts as a concept of death at all? And from that, let's start with, the bare minimum that needs to be in place, and then we can explore how complex their concept of death actually is. But yeah, very often it has been framed in these very biased terms.
Yeah, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're also sort of alluding to some sort of difference in terms of degree, that is, different concepts of death, perhaps with different complexity across different species, and not really a difference in kind, that is, either they have it or not, and if they have it, it has to be like ours, right?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, that's, I guess, one way in which you could put it. Even though I think that many animals won't have any concept of death at all, and then maybe there we can speak of a difference of kind. But for many other animals, I think it's a difference of degree. And even within humans, I think we can speak of differences of degree. So you and I are going to have a more complex concept of death than a 5-year-old, but our concept of death is going to be less complex than a pathologist, for instance, or someone who performs autopsies. So these people, I think, can better understand the causal complexities of death than we do, right? So there are always going to be degrees.
Right. What about what you call in the book a minimum concept of death? Could you tell us about it, and what kinds of aspects does it entail? I mean, is there a set of criteria, for example?
Yeah. So In order to introduce this, I need to go back to this notion that developmental psychologists usually use, and it's this idea that the human concept of death, at least the scientific concept of death, is made up of several subcomponents. And these subcomponents, sometimes they only mention 4, but they can mention up to 7, and they are non-functionality, irreversibility, universality, causality, personal mortality, inevitability, and unpredictability. So these are all like the different characteristics of death. And what I argue in my work is that out of all these, some of them are redundant and others are contingent, and the 2 that are really necessary are non-functionality and irreversibility. These are the ones that I believe need to be in place in order for us to start saying of an animal or any other kind of individual that they have some understanding of death. And this is it's not the whole story, because that animal also needs to have a certain reliability in its capacity to distinguish dead individuals, and it needs to also understand that death is non-functionality, or like irreversible non-functionality of those functions that individual typically would exhibit. So the functions of life characteristic of that individual. And this means that understood in this way, we have sort of a framework for studying how animals, or to what extent animals understand death, but it also allows for variability in how different animals understand death. And this variability comes not only from the fact that this concept can get more and more complex, but also because the ways in which animals understand what others do and what is lost when someone dies is going to exhibit a lot of variability across individuals of a same species, across different species, across one individual's own life. So I don't know, you can imagine that for a very young, playful animal, the most salient thing about dead conspecifics is that they don't play anymore. Or for a predator, the most salient thing about dead prey is that it doesn't escape or doesn't attack them anymore. Yeah. So there's a lot of room for variability in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Could you give us some examples of emotional reactions to the death of close ones? Like, for example, in the book you talk about primates.
Yeah. So there is a behavior that has received a lot of attention within comparative thanatology, which is the behavior of deceased infant carrying. So many primate mothers have been observed carrying the remains of their dead infants for periods of time that can even go up to months. So it's a behavior that is clearly very strongly motivated, but it's also kind of a puzzling behavior. It's not very clear why they do it. The animals also, there's no one hypothesis that we can give that's going to explain everything that's going on. So there's, for instance, an excellent paper by Watson and Matsuzawa where they consider all the different hypotheses that could explain these mothers' behavior, and they find that none of them is consistent with all the evidence. But of course, that makes total sense, because these are animals that are very cognitively complex, and they're going to have different personalities, they're going to have different life histories, beliefs, desires, etc. And so there might be different reasons why they are doing this, or these reasons might be similar, but they might be interacting differently with other aspects of that being's own mental life, or her environment, or her social life, etc. So yeah, it's a behavior that is to some extent puzzling, but many people consider it, and I think that it's it's quite plausibly the case that this is some kind of manifestation of the mother-infant bond and a result of something that comes very close to being grief, if it cannot be called grief. So the mother has a strong social bond to her infant for the reasons that I mentioned before, and upon the infant's death, this bond doesn't immediately dissolve. It's still there. And so, but the monkey is not responding anymore. And so there seems to be the root there for this behavior. Now, we see it most often in primate mothers because primate mothers have hands. And so this makes it somewhat easy to carry out this behavior, even though it's not super easy, especially if they are arboreal animals, because they need their hands to travel. But I think it's even more surprising when we see it in animals who don't have limbs like this. So there was a very famous case that appeared in a lot of newspapers of an orca that they nicknamed Taliqua, who was witnessed carrying the corpse of her baby for 17 days and over 1,000 miles. And now this is an animal that does not have hands, that is pushing the baby with her snout, and it's so motivated that she's not even eating, and the scientists who were watching her were really fearing for her life. So clearly there's a very strong motivation there, and it's going to be emotional in character. That's the most likely explanation. Yeah, so, but yeah, there's also examples in other species besides primates and cetaceans. Yeah.
So when it comes to the criteria to fulfill a minimum concept of death, as we talked about earlier, what do you think are the behaviors out there in whatever sort of animal that point to some or all of those criteria?
So it's difficult to say because so in the paper that I originally published on where I presented my minimal concept of death, there I gave a set of a list of behaviors that we could watch out for, and these behaviors had to do with like grieving responses or variability across individuals and aggressive responses towards corpses. So it was a list of behaviors, but since then I've really kind of thought about it a lot, and I think that it's just not easy to say what behavior would give you evidence of a concept of death, because there's just no behavior that necessarily follows from understanding that someone has died. You know, understanding that someone has died can lead you to react in a myriad ways depending on your relationship to that individual and on who you are and what's your state of mind in that moment. You know, you might be happy that they died if this means you're going to get to eat today, or you might be scared if it means there's a predator around, or you might feel curiosity, or you might feel sadness if you were very bonded to the individual, or you might be disgusted by it. You know, it's just not possible to give a set of behaviors that are going to be like really giving us clues there. So I think we definitely have to watch out for animals that display a lot of variability in their reactions to corpses, because this is going to give us a clue that there are cognitive mechanisms at play. So we definitely have to watch for that. But there's no clear recipe that we can give. So in my original paper on that, I suggested a way of approaching the question that's kind of a detour, but I think it allows us to address the issue a bit better. So the idea is, for an animal to be able to understand death, they need to be able to process non-functionality and irreversibility. for them to understand it minimally. So we want to understand whether the animal is capable of processing non-functionality and irreversibility. So a way in which we can study this, I suggested, that is also more ethical than, killing an animal to see how others react, is to use artifacts. So we can train animals to use artifacts in certain ways. And then in the experimental conditions, the artifacts can break down in a way that's either reversible or irreversible. And this can give us indirect evidence of this animal's ability to process irreversible non-functionality. Now, obviously, an artifact doesn't actually die because it's not alive to begin with. So you would kind of have to couple these experiments with tests for animacy comprehension or the ability to develop expectations about the behaviors of others, etc. And I think that this is sort of the best way in which we can address the question, because with the evidence that we have, everything can be interpreted as meaning that the animals have a concept of death or that they don't. I think perhaps the most sort of compelling case that I have seen in the literature where I really thought, wow, this is very difficult to explain without a concept of death, is a report that came out last year. It was a really, really sad story of a little baby chimpanzee that was born in a group of chimpanzees that's very, very prone to infanticide. And this chimp had the peculiarity that he was albino. So as the researchers tell the story, when the mother appeared with the baby, because mothers usually go away to give birth, when she came back with the baby, the other chimps just freaked out. Like they started making alarm calls, sort of signaling that there was something weird, a predator or some animal of a weird kind around. They became pale erect. They were clearly very, very fearful of this particular individual. And then at some point the alpha male grabs him and they start, I don't know, I can't remember the detail, but the baby chimp died. And at that point, as the researchers tell the story, there seemed to be a very radical change in their behavior. At that point, they all started surrounding the baby chimp, and they all started smelling it, sniffing it, poking at it, comparing, they're seemingly comparing the hair with their own, just very, very intensely curious. And baby chimpanzees, if they die, they usually only elicit interest from the mother. Usually the rest don't really care. They care only when it's an older member of the group. But in this particular case, a lot of the chimpanzees were very interested. So, there was a very stark change in their behaviors before and after the baby chimp had died. So that kind of strongly suggests to me that they had processed that he wasn't dangerous anymore. And that's very difficult to explain without a concept of what dying means, right? And the difference between being alive and being dead. So yeah, I think that's the best piece of evidence that I've come across. But it's a very specific story, and it's difficult to generalize from that.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to mourning behavior specifically, I mean, to what lengths do animals go? I mean, is there evidence that, for example, they might have reactions that are at least in some way similar to humans, like, for example, getting depressed, not eating, not wanting to leave the body of the other dead animal, something like that?
There are certainly many stories like that. So Barbara King, for instance, has a beautiful book called How Animals Grieve, and there she tells a lot of stories of animals going through these mourning periods and becoming, seemingly depressed. And so I already mentioned the case of Taliqua, the orca, who was carrying her baby for 17 days and not eating much throughout it. I mean, that's I think going at great lengths, right?
Yeah.
To great lengths, because of the death of her baby, apparently. And yeah, there are a lot of such stories. So Jane Goodall also tells the story of a chimpanzee who lost his mother, who he was really attached to, and then he just kind of stopped eating and became very lethargic, and eventually he died. There's another story also, another report that came out rather recently of a young gorilla who lost his mother, and they saw him also interacting with the corpse. You can see videos online. They are really sad. He's kind of sitting next to her and embracing her, and then at some point he starts suckling from the corpse, and the gorilla had been weaned. I don't know if it was like a couple of years before that, so it was kind of a regressive behavior, which somehow, yeah, suggests that, there was a very deep emotional reaction going on there. Yeah, but it's, I think all of this is not particularly surprising if we accept that these animals have strong social bonds. It's just, I think, quite normal that they're going to have these reactions or like strong emotional reactions upon the lack of response of a dead one, of a dead loved one. Yeah, but it's also difficult to say to what extent these animals are understanding that the other one has died. And I think it's also possible to grieve without a concept of death or without even knowing that someone has died. So, for instance, Barbara King tells the story of a cat who was very bonded to her sister, and then her sister was taken away to the vet to be euthanized, and the other one never saw her again. And after that, she was just seemingly very depressed and like roaming the whole house and looking for her sister and wailing, and she might not, I mean, she could not know for sure that her sister had died. Even if she did have a concept of death, she could not know it. But still, what we see is I think it's quite a compelling example of grieving.
Mm-hmm. Since we're talking a lot here about social bonds, do you think that there's anything about a particular species, social organization, or its sociality that might point to the the organisms having some sort of concept of death? I mean, the way their society is structured, the way they establish relationships with one another, could that be at least some sort of indirect way of getting to a concept of death or not?
Yeah. I think that a lot of social species are definitely going to be good candidates for a concept of death, and they certainly should be species that we look towards. And I mean, you will notice that I'm being very cautious about saying, who has a concept of death and who doesn't, even though I think that a concept of death is likely to be fairly prevalent in nature, because I think it's not a very difficult thing to acquire, at least in minimal terms. The discipline is just way too young for us to make any definitive empirical claims at the moment. But definitely, a lot of social species are going to be very good candidates. And this has to do with the fact that sociality has certain sort of contingent characteristics in nature. One of them is that social animals, as we mentioned, very often have strong social bonds that create strong emotions, and these emotions provide incentives for the animals to stay close to corpses and pay attention to them. But social animals are often cognitively complex because sociality and cognition tend to be sort of interconnected at a phylogenetic and ontogenetic level. in a way that's not necessary. So some eusocial insects, for instance, have large social groups, but it seems that the cognitive complexity at the individual level is quite low. But in other animals, they seem to sort of reinforce each other, cognition and sociality. And also in social species, very often you're going to have a lot of opportunities for learning about death because mortality rates are quite high in nature, and they're especially high amongst infants or young animals. And this is very important because in these species, I think the mother-infant bond is kind of like a good sort of breeding ground for the concept of death to emerge, right? A mother who loses her infant and then sort of like becomes very obsessed with it and then kind of grasps it. And then maybe when, you know, an older individual dies, she can maybe extrapolate and say, oh yeah, that happened to my baby too. And so like an example or like a typical species that is mentioned here that sort of fulfills all these conditions and is very iconic in its relation to death is, of course, elephants, right? Elephants are known for being very interested in the corpses of those of their species, and they seem to just be strongly motivated to be close to corpses or interact with them or touch them or smell them, and it's because it seems that I think that they find them interesting because they really have everything in place to be animals that can understand death, and especially if we think that they're quite long-lived animals. So they are going to have quite a lot of experiences, and they have these notorious memories. So yeah, they're good candidates.
Yeah. Well, before I ask the next question, let me just mention that last week I interviewed Dimitris Xigalatas, who wrote Ritual. He's an anthropologist. I will be releasing the interview in December, if I'm not mistaken. And I mean, even if the discipline thanatology is very recent, historically speaking, when we were talking about rituals, he mentioned elephants. So there are anthropologists that are also looking into this, it seems.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, experience in this case is also important, right? I mean, being exposed to corpses and dealing with death directly, because I would imagine that even for humans that we are supposedly more intellectually advanced, let's say, or complex, if we are not exposed to that, perhaps we don't have as a developed concept of death as we could for, for
Yeah.
example, pathologists or other people could have, right?
Absolutely. I think experiences are really key here for a lot of different things, right? I mean, to begin with, an individual who were not exposed to death at all or not even told about death, I mean, we would have no idea if we were somehow raised in isolation and no one told us about it. We wouldn't be able to know that we're going to die. And I think that's the case that you need experience to learn about it, and you need experience also for your concept to become more developed, more advanced. You're going to become better capable of discriminating when death has happened, etc. But for humans and animals, the learning experience, at least if we consider weird humans, it's going to be very different for us than it is for wild animals, because we typically do not learn about death from interacting with corpses. We learn about it from, you know, watching Bambi and The Lion King and asking our parents, or when our grandma suddenly, we're not going to visit her on the weekends anymore, and we ask what's up, and they tell us about it, right? And we hear these stories and we put the pieces together, and I think the fact that we learn about death this way also leads us to very often want to talk about death like as a very abstract notion, as requiring the concept of absence, etc. Because for us, like in these Western humans, the way we experience death is like someone just kind of gets taken away, they disappear from you, they're just suddenly not there, and it's like it's this absence. For animals in the wild, it's going to be very different. Maybe for humans in other societies, it is as well, because the way they learn is, well, they have a corpse right in front of them. No one is telling them about it. They have to learn solipsistically, right, from their own experiences, and they have the corpse there. And the corpse is very present. It's not absent. It's very present, but it's very different from a live individual. It's not just that it's staying still, but it smells very different, it sounds very different, it feels very different, it's not responding as it usually would, and maybe later it starts doing weird things that living beings don't do, like smelling very strongly or being covered in maggots or putrefying, etc. And so I think it's a very different learning experience, and that might make it easier for animals than it is for human children to learn about certain aspects of death. Like, for instance, the irreversibility concept might be easier to grasp for an animal who is, in front of a corpse and maybe shaking the corpse and shaking it and getting no response and no response and no response. It might be easier to grasp that than for a kid whose grandma suddenly disappears and then mom says, you're never going to see her again. And it's just very difficult to understand. And human children typically struggle a lot with that particular component. So yeah, it's a different learning experience. And I think the concept of death is probably going to be different as a result.
Mm-hmm. Of course, you've already mentioned several times during our interview that this discipline, thanatology, is very young, but, and I'm not sure to what extent this question might be fair or not, but with what we know now at least, is it possible in any way to speculate about where in evolution might a concept of death first have originated?
Yeah, it's not very easy to answer because, yes, I said we know very little. But what I can say is that I think that the concept of death, as I said, the minimal concept of death does not require a lot of complexity. And it is, to me, linked to cognitive capacities that have very high survival value. So things such as being able to discriminate animacy, so being able to distinguish animate from inanimate objects, so that you can have a notion of life it's a notion that you need to understand death, right? They are kind of sisters in that regard. You can't have one without the other. And we know, for instance, that the capacity to distinguish biological from non-biological movement is extremely widespread in nature. Like there are studies showing this in jumping spiders, for instance, or one particularly compelling example is a study by Ortegara and colleagues where they raised chicks in complete darkness. So these chicks had never had any visual stimuli at all. And then the first thing that they saw, they were put on this platform, and then on either side of the platform there were lights, and these lights displayed biological movement on one side and non-biological movement on the other. And these are the very first things that these chicks saw, and they were immediately drawn to the biological movement. So it seems to be innate, at least for this species, which suggests it goes, very back in time. And to learn about death, you also need, just the capacity to develop expectations about how animals in your environment typically behave, and you need to be able to update these expectations depending on your experience, which is yeah, not a very difficult thing to be able to do. So it's just very hard for me to say how far back it can go, because these abilities have not been studied as much as need to make these kinds of claims. But my hunch is that it's going to be quite extended in nature, just because, yeah, the cognition you require is not very complex, and it's not, and it's a cognition that is very important for animals to have, and a lot of animals are also going to have a lot of experiences with death, or death is very, very prevalent in nature, much more than it is in our Western societies.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to get now into the part of your book where you talk about violence and predation and what that might have to do with death, or an understanding of death, a concept of death. But to introduce the topic, what's the deal with the animal you chose for the title of your book? In
Yeah,
Spanish, la zarigüeya, and in English, the opossum. What's
yeah.
the deal there?
So the opossum is an animal who has a very iconic death display. So when the opossum feels threatened and feels that she cannot fight or escape, she plays dead. And she plays dead in a way that is very, very, well, impressive, I would say, because it's made up of a lot of different behavioral components. So the opossum, she adopts like the posture and the facial expression of a corpse, and then she just stays still, and then her body temperature drops, her breathing and her heart rate drop. She's going to defecate and urinate and expel a putrid smelling liquid from her anal glands, and she just stops responding to the world. So you could even, pinch her tail or whatever, and she just wouldn't react. So she's very, very convincingly disguised as a corpse. And she's not. She's actually alive. So she's sort of like Schrödinger's cat, because she's dead and alive at the same time. That's why the book is called Schrödinger's opossum. And I really like this example because for me, it gives us a very compelling clue as to how extended the concept of death is going to be in nature. And this doesn't come from the fact that the opossum herself knows that she's dead. I believe that the opossum, at least, a young opossum that doesn't know much, doesn't really know what she's doing. And I guess it's just an automatic reaction, the same way that our pupils dilate or our hair goes on end when we are scared. But the thing is that behavior has emerged in all this complexity. And in order to explain its emergence, you have to postulate a selective pressure that is going to have given shape to it. And this pressure is going to come from the predator's cognition. So it's the predators, their own concept of death, that which has given shape to the opossum's display, right? So it's a more complicated argument than that, but that's kind of the gist. And that's why, I finished that chapter of the book, and I called my editor and I said, look, this is going to be the title of the book. And I know that it sucks, because the book, that means that the title is going to have 2 words with the little dots in Spanish, which almost no words have them. A lot of people don't know what an opossum is in Spain because we don't have opossums. A lot of people don't know who Schrödinger is. So it was a bit of a risky title, but I felt like this is the title because the opossum is really capturing the essence of what I'm trying to say in the book, which is this idea that, the concept of death is not that big a deal, and a lot of animals are probably gonna have it. Yeah, and also the opossum is important because I feel that a lot of anthropocentric biases have been leading the comparative thanatologists astray or have been influencing their thoughts until now. And I think that's normal because we are, like, the discipline is very young and we start from us, and it's normal that they're kind of trying to find the human in other animals and the human-like reactions to death in other animals. But that has led them to over-intellectualize the concept of death, and it has also led them to focus excessively on human-like reactions to death. So there are certain animal reactions to death that never make it to thanatology papers, like, for instance, the behavior of pets who feed on their dead owners, which I think is a pretty interesting behavior, but is never mentioned by thanatologists, and presumably because it's just not a reaction that they deem interesting enough, and perhaps because it's not human enough. This emotional anthropocentrism, as I call it, has led them to focus a lot on grief and grief-like reactions in animals. But as I already mentioned, death can generate all kinds of emotions, and death can also interact with a lot of different behaviors and a lot of different cognitive capacities. And one aspect of animal behavior that's related to death that is just not properly attended to in these debates is violence. And the opossum is an example of how violent contexts and violent behaviors can give rise to a concept of death. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's why she's on my cover.
Well, before I ask the next question, let me just tell you that thanks to you, I now know the word for opossum in Spanish, but I don't know the word for it in Portuguese. So.
See, that's because we don't have opossums in the Iberian Peninsula, right?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm a good representative of the general public, but I would say that the opossums are not very popular.
Yeah, they're not very well known, no, which is unfortunate because they're very cool and also cute. So they should be better known.
Yeah, I now know that they are, but I didn't before. So anyway, let's get then into violence and predation specifically. So why would there be a relationship between predation and an understanding of death?
Well, I already mentioned how sociality is a hotspot for the emergence of the concept of death, but it seems that predation, in theory, would also be a hotspot for similar but different reasons. So the first one is that, like in the case of sociality, we also see sometimes a relationship between being a predator and being cognitively complex, or at least we see this in large predators who actively hunt their prey. They tend to be quite intelligent, and specifically they have a cognition that seems to be particularly attuned to the functionality of prey. And this, of course, has to do with the fact that prey that doesn't, or that displays partial non-functionality is easier to catch, right? So we see animals monitoring, herds of prey in order to find out which ones are weaker, which ones are older, or might be sick or injured, the ones that are easier to catch. And this is already focus on functionality. And we see some animals actually exploiting this, right? I love this example of the piping plover who pretends to have a broken wing, right? Because she nests on the floor and she wants to lure predators away from her nest. So she pretends to have a broken wing and she's like, oh, catch me, look, I'm an easy catch. Why don't you go in this direction? And then lures them away. So it's great, but it shows us that predators do have this tendency to monitor functionality. And second of all, there are strong emotions involved in the hunt and kill, so it seems to be something that they find exciting, that they seem to enjoy, or there seems to be an element of play to it in some species more than others, but we seem to find it there. And there is especially a very strong emotional incentive to pay attention to the specific moment in which a prey animal dies. And this has to do with the fact that these animals, prey animals, are very often dangerous animals. So they typically have sharp hooves or horns or claws. And it's not uncommon for a predator to be injured or even killed in the hunt. And also, predators very often have very, very low success rates. So like something like 10% or something like that. Mm-hmm. So this means, that the moment in which the prey is dead and no longer able to attack or escape becomes very salient to the predator. And last of all, we've got very, very high experience levels, because predators, especially if they make it to maturity, and especially if they're carnivores, well, they need to hunt in order to live. So they literally cannot survive without killing. And this means that, that they have daily opportunities for learning. And eventually this is going to add up. I don't think that it's plausible to say that they need a concept of death in order to hunt. Obviously, that's not the case, because they have hunting instincts or whatever way before that. But I think it's going to be inevitable that they're going to develop some notion of death as their own life progresses. And note how already this concept of death is going to be very different from the concept of death of a mother who loses her precious infant, right? Because in one case it's a loss, and in the other case it's a gain. So already the emotions attached to it are very different, and maybe also the behaviors that they are noting that are not present is different in both cases. But yeah, so it's a very good breeding ground again for the concept of death, and I think it's a place that we should be looking at, and comparative thanatologists have typically not discussed this context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that talking about the example of how predators might have some understanding of death versus the understanding of death that mothers have, mothers who lose their infants, and the understanding of death that perhaps humans have, also goes to show the richness in an understanding of death. I mean, as we said before, it's not that all animals necessarily have to have the exact same understanding of death, even within the same species. And the idea that some people have that either other animals have the same cognitive capacities as we have, and if they don't, they can't have an understanding of death just because they don't intellectualize it, just seems nonsense, right?
Yeah, that's my view, definitely.
Yeah, and what about infanticide specifically?
Yeah.
Because it's one thing just for the infant to die naturally, let's say, but infanticide is somewhat different, right?
Yeah. So infanticide, I mean, like the case of predation, it's important to also mention that there's a spectrum of cognitive complexity here. And like there are some cases of predation that involve either no cognition or very little cognition. Like think about, well, the example of plants, right? There are some plants that are carnivorous, they're a kind of predator, but they might be just, I can't remember the name in English, but they're plants that are shaped like a vase like this, and they have these these juices at the bottom.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, but I also can't remember the
Right.
name now.
Well, it doesn't matter, but anyway, the fly is drawn to the smell of the juices, and then it can't fly back out, and then it's digested, right? That's a form of predation, but there's no cognition there. The plant's just sitting there. We have some something that looks like cognition also in plants. For instance, the Venus flytrap famously has some hairs on its mouth. I'm going to call it a mouth, even it's not. It has some hairs, and when the fly or whatever lands on it and touches the hairs 3 times, then they snap shut. And then when the fly reaches 5 touches, then they start to secrete the juices to digest it. So there is some minimal cognition going on there, some form of counting going on there, right? And some minimal behavior. But of course, if you compare that to, the very, very complicated hunting behavior in killer whales, for instance, where we have coordination between individuals. I was watching the other day an amazing video. It was really heartbreaking, but there was a group of orcas that were hunting a seal that was just sitting on a block of ice, and they were coordinating their swimming so as to create a wave that would topple the ice and make the seal fall. So I mean, imagine the difference in complexity with the Venus flytrap, right? And the same goes for infanticide. So in the case of infanticide, we have some animals, like for instance, some rodents who like if they are paired with infants that smell a particular way, they will automatically try to eat them, right? And it just has to do with certain smells being present, and also when they mated with the female. I can't remember right now the details, but like if the female is taken away during the pregnancy and then comes back, then the male is going to try to eat the babies or things like that. So it seems very stereotypical in that regard. So kind of very rigid rules. And we can compare that from cases, like certain cases of infanticide among the great apes, for instance, where we see the male monitoring the female and her baby and looking for the right time to attack, because they know that if they attack at the wrong time, they're going to get a beating or they might not succeed. And they are very patient, and they pick their moment really carefully. And it seems like there is much more of an intention there than in the first case. The same way as we can more clearly talk about an intention in the killer whales than in the Venus flytrap, right? Even though there is in both the rodent and the plant, there is some cognition, some monitoring the stimuli in their environment and reacting to it. It's different from what we see on the other side of the spectrum, where there's careful planning and there's careful choosing the moment and choosing the course of action, etc. So it's these kinds of more complex behaviors that I think show a higher degree of intentionality, and it's these higher degrees of intentionality where you can maybe even talk about the animals intending to kill the other one, and that might that involves the concept of death, or it might be, a place for the concept of death to emerge.
Mm-hmm. We've already touched on this earlier, but what does thanatosis have to do with an understanding of death? I mean, because we've been talking about several different, let's say, relationships, social relationships, and predator-prey relationship that might lead to the development of an understanding of death. But what about thanatosis specifically?
Yeah, so very often what we see in animals, in their characteristics or their behavior, can tell us some things about the minds of the animals around them, not just about the animals themselves. So a typical example that is used a lot in biology is the peacock's tail. The peacock's tail tells us something about what the peahen finds attractive, right? It gives us a window into her mind and into what she likes.
Sexual selection in this case.
Exactly, that's a case of sexual selection. But we also have cases where what we see in an animal's behavior or phenotypes is gives us a clue as to their predators' cognition. So an example, for instance, is what's called Bayesian mimicry. So it's cases where animals that are not toxic mimic the appearance of animals that are toxic. So, for instance, we know that bees and wasps have these yellow and black stripes because they signal toxicity. And some flies that are totally harmless also have this appearance. And this appearance is advantageous to them because predators have the capacity to associate a certain look with toxicity. So it's telling us something about how the minds of the predators work. And the idea with thanatosis is similar. The idea is this behavior is extremely complex, right? So thanatosis consists of playing dead, and it's playing dead. In the way I use this term, it refers to cases of very complex forms of playing dead. So the opossum is one case, and there are also, for instance, and one of my favorite examples is the I can't remember in English the term, but it's a snake, or it happens in several snakes, but they also have a very elaborate thanatosis display, which also is preceded by a display of death. So first they pretend that they're dying and it's sort of like writhing erratically, like, oh no, I'm dying. And then they lie belly up with their tongues hanging out and no visible signs of breathing, and they might even secrete blood from their mouth. So it's like a super elaborate display as well. And it's very interesting for me that it comes first with a performance of death, right? And in this case, we have all these behaviors that are made up of all these subcomponents that are heterogeneous. I mean, there's no connection between lying belly up and secreting blood from your mouth and having your tongue hanging out and not breathing, etc., except for the fact that these are all things that you can find in a corpse. Yeah. So the idea is, in order to give an explanation for why these behaviors occur simultaneously as part of the same defense mechanism, you have to postulate a concept of death in the predator that would have acted as a selection pressure and given shape to these behaviors, in the sense that the more convincing that they found these death displays, the less likely they were going to eat them, and so the more likely it would be for them to get to reproduce and pass on this ability to further generations. So that's why I think thanatosis is so interesting. And also it's interesting because we see elaborate thanatosis displays in what appear to be quite distantly related species. So it seems to be a case of convergent evolution. And that would suggest, again, that the concept of death is quite prevalent in nature, and not just, the case of elephants, but also a lot of other animals.
Mm-hmm. So I have another question to ask you that I missed asking before, and I think will be relevant for the last part of our interview, the last topic I want to ask you about. If other animals have a concept of death, is it necessarily conscious or not?
As how I'm understanding the term, yes. So Of course, it's difficult to say what exactly this means, but in how I'm understanding the term, it means that the animal can engage in certain inferences using its concept, and it can kind of develop expectations and realize when these expectations are broken. And it's just very difficult to see how that would be realized without any consciousness. I guess, I mean, it's possible for information processing to happen at a purely unconscious level, but given how I am understanding it to interact with emotions, etc., I would presume that we're talking about a conscious concept of death.
Mm-hmm. So, for the last topic, then, do you think that this could have some ethical implications? I mean, if we know that other animals also have a concept of death, whatever it might be, even if it's less complex than ours, could it have some implications? I mean, because I imagine, I mean, I know that there are philosophers then when they talk about the badness of death associated with killing someone, for example, one of the things they mention is the fact that the person that's killed understands death and has some sort of understanding that their life will not continue, they won't be here, they would miss out on things that might happen later on in their life. So if other animals also have that, at least to some extent, would that have ethical implications as well?
Yeah, so this is a question that I get a lot, and I think there are ethical implications that follow at very different levels. So for one, I think that, at a very general level, if we can find a concept of death in animals, then that is one less reason to think of the human species as unique and superior to other species, right? So it has kind of, the ability to also subvert this view of humanity as unique. So that's just from a very general perspective. But I also think that there are like more concrete implications that follow. Some of them have to do with how animals understand the death of others and how the deaths of others affect them. So this is usually what's called the indirect harms of death. And I really don't like this term. So it's the idea that death harms you not only when it happens to you, but also when it happens to those you love. And this is called the indirect harms of death. I don't like that term because it suggests that these are not very important harms of death, and I think that arguably they are the more important ones, because it's a cliche in the movies, this idea of the hero or heroine sacrificing their life to save the life of their loved one. And I think it has to do with the fact that many of us would rather die than lose the people that we care about the most and have to go through that. And for many people, it can absolutely destroy them. So, and we seem to see some hints that animals might go through similar, very, very hard experiences upon the loss of a loved one. So,
sorry to interrupt, just to comment that perhaps it could even be argued, at least to some extent, that the death of a loved one might be worse for the people who stay here, who are alive, than for the dead person, because I mean the dead person won't suffer any further psychological consequences of that. I mean, of course, it's supposedly the ultimate bad for the person who died, but the other people will stay here and suffer the consequences for a long time, probably.
Yeah, exactly. I think you can absolutely make that case, that it is worse for the people who stay behind. So, and I think that understanding death can definitely influence how much the death of someone hurts, because you're grasping the finite nature of this fact, right? But also, arguably, the concept of death, as I understand it, even though it mostly refers to how animals understand the deaths of others, not their own. It can have implications also for the direct harms of death. So I'm working on a paper right now with Paez, who is a philosopher from the Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. And together we are arguing that this de-intellectualization of the concept of death that I've carried out in my work has the implication that understanding personal mortality is no longer a completely out of reach goal for animals, but that it's almost within reach, when they can almost grasp it with their fingers, right? Even if they don't fully understand that this will happen to them, their cognition is just very, very close to that once they have a minimal concept of death. And so we argue that this is important because the views that deny that death harms animals because of their lack of a concept of death typically follow what's called a desire-based account of good, right? They say that death does not harm animals because they can't desire not to die, because they don't have a concept of death. But for these theories, these desire-based theories, what matters is not the actual desires of individuals, but their ideal desires. And this is very easy to see if, for instance, imagine that I'm coming back from a run and I'm very thirsty and I form a desire to drink from this glass. In theory, drinking from this glass would be good for me because it will fulfill my desire. But imagine that instead of water, this glass contained poison, then obviously it would not be good for me to drink from this. And this is because my desire was not formed under ideal epistemic conditions, right? I am confused about the contents of this glass. So my ideal desire is actually not to drink from that glass, and to drink from a glass that contains actual water. And we develop an argument that is a bit more complex than what I can reproduce here, that basically amounts to this idea that under ideal conditions, we can postulate a desire not to die in animals and this is allowed by the fact that animals with a minimal concept of death are already close enough for us to be able to say that under ideal conditions, they do have this desire because it's so within their reach. Yeah. So I do think that it has implications for the badness of death at various different levels for animals.
Yeah, I also wanted to ask you that question because when we hear from people who do work on animal ethics and veganism, for example, we hear about things like consciousness, emotions, the ability to process pain, complex socio-cognitive abilities, complex sociality, and so on. But perhaps having some sort of understanding of death is something that might be missing from the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it has usually been taken for granted by both sides of the debate that animals can't understand death, and this is because death has typically been the concept of death, has typically been understood in this kind of binary sense, or like this sort of monolithic understanding of it, where you either have the full-blown thing or nothing at all. And in order to properly determine whether animals understand death, I think we needed to rephrase the question slightly in the way that I have done, so that we're not just biasing the question already from the start by taking a very, very cognitively complex notion of the concept of death as the subject of our question.
Mm-hmm. Great. So the book is again La zarigüeya de Schrödinger, Cómo viven y entienden la muerte los animales. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview, and hopefully there are enough Spanish-speaking people out there before the English version eventually comes out. Dr. Monsó, just before we go, would you like to, apart from the book, mention any places on the internet where people can find you and your work?
Well, I guess the best place to find me is on Twitter. So I'm on Twitter, and I'm one of these annoying accounts that's just basically self-promotion. So it's the best place to find what I'm working on and what my latest stuff is. And I also post any upcoming talks or interviews, etc. are always posted there. Otherwise, on my website, I also usually have the more important stuff present, available. So I think I'm quite easy to find online.
Okay, so I will be leaving also links to all of that in the description box of the interview. And thank you again so much for taking the time to come on the show. And I really loved the book, so I hope this helps promoting it.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sure it will. Thank you so much for reading it, and thank you for your very interesting questions. And it's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Okay, so
Very interesting questions, and it's been a real pleasure talking to you.
hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Ian Ricalania, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Wo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Enguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernardini, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Ivan Bodrenko, Paul Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Aslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dajla Araújo, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonho Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Dennis Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, Sunny Smith, and John Wiseman. My producers Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Luís Caetano, Tom Wagner, Dan Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.